legislation formalizes the rights of newcomers in response to national efforts to enforce dehumanizing laws and regulations. So being welcomed as a guest in a sanctuary city gives you institutionalized rights, and it provides you then with access and opportunities that would otherwise be denied to newcomers. But yet, as guests, newcomers are subject still to unequal power dynamics, as a result of the existing hierarchical social order of that particular society. But yet these unequal power dynamics are contested in everyday practice as newcomers, with the help of their citizen allies, seek to have their lives, their lived lives, symbolically and in actuality legitimized in these new spaces. So pushing beyond the institutionalized rights, which only offers access and opportunity, then is this political struggle to belong through practices that make visible the connections between places, such as new home and old home, and times, such as the past, present, and future. And I started reading about sanctuary cities in 2016 as a result of the election and dialogue in my own city about whether we wanted to become a sanctuary city. And I began to think a lot about how this notion of rightful presence actually speaks really strongly to life in classrooms and life in schools. And so we can think about it this way. Students are guests in classrooms in the sense that they're not in charge. They're expected to follow dominant routines and practices with the threat of disciplinary or academic sanctions for noncompliance. Youth who are historically marginalized in science and schooling, particularly Black and brown youth, but also because of immigration status, language, sexuality, or gender, even if positioned as a welcome guest in classrooms, which we all know is not always the case, are expected to reconfigure themselves towards the majority culture. Just think about how we evaluate performance through high-stakes examinations. So we can begin to think about rightful presence in education as legitimate membership in a community because of who one is and not because of who other people say they should be, where the practices of that classroom and school community work towards and support a restructuring of power dynamics towards more just ends through making both injustices and social change visible. In schools, we can think about rightful presence as a critical mode for making present those who've been made missing by forms of racialization and colonization manifest in schooling and manifest in the daily practices of schooling through the ways in which we define what learning is and what the outcomes of learning should be. So, who youth are and want to be would look really different in classrooms, and I bet it looks different in your classrooms, if students were more than guests, if students had a rightful presence in their STEM classrooms. The youth I've worked with, for example, have stated that an important form of expertise that matters a lot to them, that should be valued in schools, is that of a, quote, community science expert. As one young woman said, that is, quote, doing things that are good for the community because of what we know. We know a lot of science, and we know a lot about our community. Who else can put these ideas together? So here, in this notion of a community science expert, the youth's community knowledge, it's not a resource for fitting into the dynamics that are already at play in classrooms, but it's about upending what really counts. Equity and inclusion isn't and shouldn't just be about incorporating people into those things that already exist. It's about changing that which already exists. So this stance put forth by the youth is not trivial. Embedded within it is an epistemological shift which accounts for, as Eve Tuck might say, quote, the loss and despair, but the hope and the vision and the wisdom of lived lives and communities. So many youth actively seek a rightful presence in STEM as they work to become in STEM, and we need to learn from them, especially those who've been denied such presence. So take, for example, Quentin. In a letter he wrote to his teacher while he was in the 5th grade. Now, he wrote this letter in January, and he was in a self-contained classroom, so he had the same teacher since August. And so the very first paragraph of this letter, "Hey, Mr. B, this is your student Quentin," the first one in the 2nd row. He reminds us just how many other youth feel marginal and even invisible in science class, assuming that his teacher doesn't know his name. But if we jump down to the 3rd paragraph and the 5th paragraphs, it poignantly points to his care, his curiosity, his intellect and his humor, and his commitment to engaging in science deeply in community, and his desire to be recognized for it in school settings. He says, "I do things out of school and out of Get City that involve science. I went door to door and asked adults if they use CFL lights. The majority of adults did not use CFL lights. I'll try to decrease the amount of people who use incandescent lights. I did it on Wainwright Ave. I did it because people's bills were up. And people's bills are up because they just use incandescent lights." And so in this letter to his teacher, Quentin's bid for legitimacy is an attempt on his part to begin to claim a rightful presence in science, in school science. He leverages his humor, his curiosity, his activism, his care, the very things that were getting him in trouble in school, as forms of capital with which to engage in STEM. Oh, guess the light. Well, you have a PDF. So I want to suggest that learning and becoming in STEM as a community science expert can transform the boundaries of participation in STEM in the moment and over time towards a more rightful presence, especially among youth growing up in non-dominant communities, where the structures preventing rightful presence remain large in both real and symbolic ways. So to unpack this claim, what I want to do is suggest that seeking a rightful presence in STEM as a community science expert involves navigating 2 different dialectics, which can open up the boundaries of STEM. The 2 dialectics being community STEM and expert activism. I mean, I think we can see those dialectics playing out in Samuel's opening quote and in Quentin's letter, and even in the definition of what a community science expert is. But what I want to do is to share with you another case to unpack these dialectics a little bit more. And so this case is part of a larger study where we followed 41 youth STEM makers over 3 years in 2 different out-of-school STEM maker programs. And I selected this particular case of Sincere to share with you today because it topically relates to all of your work in gardening, and because it helps keep these intersectional geometries of power in the foreground. So let me tell you a little bit about Sincere first, before I tell you about how he spent 9 months designing and prototyping a greenhouse for his community club, greenhouse garden for his community club. So when Samuel was 13, is when he worked on this project. And what he says of himself is, quote, "I'm not a nerd, but I'm not average either. I'm a goofy kid that still gets the job done efficiently and well. And he cares a lot about his family, especially his younger sister, for whom he loves very much and provides care to when his mom cannot. And he feels really strongly, as you can see in the 3rd quote, that he can help make a difference in his community, but he worries about how much of an impact he can have. Quote, I got power to do small little things in my community or stuff like that. And then later on he goes to describe how he doesn't necessarily have the power to make big changes. So at the same time though, Sincere, like many of his peers of color, experiences structural and symbolic racism in school limiting his opportunities to thrive there. He told us that his white teacher labeled him as a disruptive, quote, problem that needed solving. Quote, she told my mom that I might have something wrong with my brain because I'd had too much energy and I might need to go on medicine. I want to prove that's not right. I can put the energy to something good. He had a record for getting in trouble at school because he was so energetic and social. This reflects the historicized injustices of many Black youth who are disproportionately disciplined for doing the same kinds of things as their white peers. He noted his struggle in wanting to be heard, but also in not getting in trouble. He said, I've been thinking about racism for a long time. I had a kid call me a monkey before, and the N-word. I tried to tell a teacher, and the teacher didn't do anything about it. It hurt me, because I wanted them to get in trouble, but I didn't want to get myself in trouble. So let's keep that in mind as I tell you now a little bit more about his design and building of this greenhouse. So Sincere designed and prototyped what he called a, quote, high-tech greenhouse that started with a donated indoor tower garden. And he planted several herbs and lettuces, and as he said, quote, we planted veggies to support healthier, affordable lives. Already kids pick the veggies and eat them. They really want fresh food. He referred to his prototype as green because he used solar panels to power the fans, and he regularly gathered data to chart insulation and airflow for temperature control. So let's unpack Sincere's experiences together to make sense of how he navigated these two different dialectics of community and STEM and expert activism. So, like the majority of the youth makers that we followed, the idea for a greenhouse was grounded in Sincere's desire to make something that would be helpful to his friends and the people in his community. So being helpful, when you look at the way in which Sincere talks about it, is rooted in a desire to care, but also in a desire to disrupt and transform. As he states, quote, kids don't have healthier options to eat after school. Our club had bad food options. I want to make a greenhouse to share healthier options at the club. So his idea of care is nested in understanding the needs of the young people in his community. Kids are hungry after school, and there are few healthy and substantive choices in the after-school programs. Many, like he himself, stay at the club until 8 p.m. when it closes. And as Sincere noted in his interview, he felt his idea for a greenhouse would help his whole neighborhood by, quote, providing to the poor and the humans in need and helping his city's reputation. So, Sincere's understanding of his community needs are historicized. In the months before Sincere started the greenhouse project, his troubles at school spilled over into his after-school club. He'd been caught several times walking the mile from his school to the community club instead of taking the school bus because he wanted to stop at a little bodega on the way to get some food to eat. And so it's like the only store in between school and the club. It doesn't really have any healthy food options and is kind of expensive. And so Sincere's experiences of growing up in a food desert reflect that of many Black and brown youth who disproportionately live with food insecurity on a daily basis. He said that if he had, quote, better snack options at the center, he would feel less tempted to, quote, run away to the store. Even then, he was frustrated because, as I mentioned, the store was expensive. And so here you can see how these injustices are multiplying, causing him to be suspended from school because of his food insecurity, making him even more food insecure without being able to get the food at school. So if we look at how Sincere built the greenhouse and his explanations of the process, we can see how he put this historicized knowledge of community and dialectic with STEM towards his desired goals. And in the process, he not only deepened his knowledge of STEM, but he deepened his commitment and care for and knowledge of his community. So first, as I alluded to earlier, Sincere leveraged upon community concerns to organize his project, to complement his club's canteen. For example, Sincere surveyed and interviewed 62 different community members as he kicked this project off. And it was through those interviews that he learned the term food security, which he had not heard before, but which he felt once he learned what it was from a community member, that it was something he was experiencing. He also noticed that people were worrying about how food security connected to their health, but also connected to economics. As he noted, pulled out some of the survey responses that, quote, some people die for not eating healthy. Quote, we need more affordable small stores that sell produce and not just chips and gum. And quote, kids need more food variety, but parents don't make enough to provide. And so he took those ideas into account as he began to think about what would go into his greenhouse, but who his greenhouse might reach. But then Sincere also considered community desires and needs as he designed particular STEM investigations in order to get the food planted there. He decided he wanted to grow a salsa garden in his interviews because his interviews with peers showed that their favorite snacks at the canteen were the spicy Takis and the nachos. So his initial STEM investigations related to the growing conditions needed for lettuce, herbs, peppers, tomatoes, and the onions that he wished to plant. And then with support from his STEM club teachers, Sincere conducted experiments on how plants grow in greenhouses